we doing? What's up, everyone? So I want to make some announcements before we start here. I have a new video up with Marty Friedman, an interview that's really great. I don't know how many of you know Marty. I assume all of you do. If you don't, you should know Marty. Marty's one of the greatest guitar players in the world and a very old friend of mine. And I did an interview with him that I put up last night on this channel. And you should really go check it out because it's really fascinating. He's playing a bunch of cuts from, we're playing and talking about some cuts from his new record. And I would highly encourage you to check that out. Also, I have a coupon for $25 off my Mastering Modes of the Major Scale course, which is the biggest discount I've had for 24 hours, and the code is RB12. Is that right? No, RB25. 25, right, RB25. That's the coupon code. So if you're interested in getting it and you're waiting until it came down in price, today's the day, 24 hours. Okay, we're talking about double miking drums. Are there people watching Michelle? Michelle's helping me out here because we're going to be moving around between a couple different setups here.
200 people watching.
Okay, great.
23 likes.
Okay, so double miking drums. Most of you are familiar with miking a snare drum top and bottom. That's pretty standard. That's been around since the 70s or so. People would typically in those days, if they couldn't get enough snare sound, they would put a mic on the bottom of the snare. But when you were limited with tracks, if you're running 16 track, 24 tracks, 8 tracks, things like that, you always had to make a decision. Are you going to blend the mics? Do you really need that? Nowadays that you can put samples on individual drums and you can fix them, a lot of people will just put up the mics and then end up replacing them later. Now, the problem with that is that the mics don't actually sound that good unless you have them in your overheads. Because otherwise you start ending up having to duck out all the low end in your overheads. You got to think about phasing. If you're recording a rock band, for example, me personally, it depends on how I'm recording the drums. If I'm doing really heavy rock and I want the snare to have a real space in it to cut through heavy guitars, then I'm going to end up dumping out a lot of the mid-range. I might high pass it all the way up to 400 hertz or so, or 500 even. But to have a really natural fat drum sound, you're going to want to have the drums having some low end in the overheads. Let's talk about the individual drums though, because that's what today's talk is about. Now I have a particular setup here on this tom, and I'm talking about the toms first because a lot of you might not be familiar with this technique. This is a technique that I learned years ago from Brendan O'Brien, who's a fantastic producer, he worked with the Black Crowes. On the first 2 records, he engineered Blood Sugar Sex Magic by the Chili Peppers, which is one of the greatest sounding records. But he also did every Pearl Jam record, other than the first, pretty much. Rage Against the Machine, mixed and produced everything but the first record. Actually, he didn't mix the second record, Evil Empire. Andy Wallace mixed it, but he produced that. He produced Train, he produced Korn, he produced Audio Slave. So I was in the studio one time here. There used to be a studio that's since closed called Southern Tracks. And I went in and I made a record. This is way back in 2000. And I went in to check out the studio, and Brendan had set up the drums. He was recording Train at the time, I believe, and he had his drums set up. And I was getting a tour of the studio, which I had never been in before. Very few people ever used it. Southern Tracks was a one-room studio, had an SSL console, had a beautiful Osberger live room, that sounded incredibly good. They had an open drum room that would feed out into the live room, and the drum room, so he would have the doors wide open and usually put the drums right in the doorway so that you'd get this big room sound, but they'd be more controlled since the drum room wasn't obviously as high as the main room. So the first thing I noticed on the drums is that he was double miking the toms, and I walked up through. I was having a tour with the studio engineer. I can't remember if his name was Carl. I think Carl was the studio engineer. He's showing me around, and I walked up to the drums and I looked and I said, "Wow, that's really odd. What is this?" So Brendan had a Sennheiser 421 on the top of the tom, and he had an SM57. Michelle, can you see this down here? On the bottom of the tom. But what I noticed was this, was that he had a Y cable connected to them. And I said to Carl, what's the deal? He goes, that's how Brendan always records his drums. He always records the top and bottom of the toms. Now, like I said, it's common to do this with the snare drum, but you don't usually see this. Now, the thing is that you have to have a cable specially made. So this particular cable I had made, and I have a piece of tape on it down here. And that's the out of phase one. So what you have to do is you have to have the top and bottom mics out of phase with each other, so that the phase is aligned, because you have air moving down away from this as you strike the drum. When you strike it, the drum head moves away from the microphone, okay, and it moves towards the other microphone. So if the mics were in phase with each other, they would actually cancel the sound out. So I had this cable built by a company called Redco. I had a bunch of cables built in this particular way with the they put the tape on it. I said I want it going to one XLR, and one of the reasons that he's using the 421, now this is a typical tom mic that you would have. This is probably the most standard tom mic, the Sennheiser 421. If you're gonna buy a couple mics for recording and you wanna record bands or anything like that, the two mics you buy are SM57 and a 421, because they're used on guitar cabs. Anytime you double mic anything, they're a great combination. This gets a lot more bottom end than this. But this and this together, they're both dynamic mics, so you don't have to worry about phantom power or anything. The blend of them gives a complete snapshot of the drum. That's the beauty of this. When you hear this, because it's going to one mic pre, okay, you don't have to use two mic pre's, so you're actually saving on your inputs. But what you typically do with toms is that you will dip out around 500 hertz. You always end up dipping out mid-range from your toms because they sound papery if you don't. Well, the thing about using the two mics is that they self-correct. The phasing, because of the bottom mic is capturing that sound, they naturally give you a complete sound where you don't have to dump out nearly as much mid-range. If I had a different mic on the bottom, let's say I had a Beta 52 or something to catch the bottom end. I've tried all these different mics. You have that, Michelle? So Beta 52 is a typical kick drum mic that you have. This is a Shure Beta 52. This is typically a kick drum mic or a mic for the bass cabinet. Okay?
Show the top, probably.
This is, oh yeah, you can see it right there.
Yep.
This mic is, I don't know, probably about $190 or so. These are great kick drum mics. So if you did something like this, it would have, it just doesn't have the right EQ curve to it and doesn't sound good as it does with this particular pairing. The other pairing that I do, if I'm not going to record, if I'm going to record on two channels separately, and I have, and I'm using someone else's mic setup, I'll put a 414, usually an older one, like a BULS on the top, or a TL2 AKG, and I will put a 421 on the bottom. That's another way. And I learned that drum miking technique from Ben Gross, who's a great engineer. He mixed a lot of, he produced Filter, he mixed a lot of rock records. He's an excellent engineer, and I went to a studio of his back in 1995 before I even started producing, and I was playing in a band. I was subbing on bass for a band that was signed to A&M Records at the time, and I spent a couple days at the studio, and I was writing down all the mics that he was using on the drums, and I was the dumb guy that didn't know anything about miking, and Ben, I think, was laughing because I said 57. What is that? I was that kind of guy. So when I first started producing, I had this notebook of all these different mics. So I put that particular mic combination, the 414 on the top and the 421 on the bottom, and I started using that. But I would have them go into separate channels because the 414 is a condenser mic and it requires phantom power. The beauty of this, using the Y cable, is that you use one mic pre. So you're EQing the sound of both mics together. Now, some of the things that you want to keep in mind with this is you want to keep the same relative distance from the head on both sides. Okay, so I would typically use probably about 3 fingers on my hand would be about the height that I would be above the drum. You don't have to face it towards the center. I usually face it a little bit here more on the outer part of the head to get some more overtones. On the bottom, same kind of thing. I will usually line them up to where they're roughly in the same area of the drum. Now, if the drummer's playing accurately, he's not going to destroy your mic. But you can get these mics bashed. And I've had some of the windscreens replaced on these. Sennheiser, if you send it to them, they will replace those. And I want to say that they replaced them for free, if I remember. But this one has a dent on it, and I know what it's from. It's from some drummer, some knucklehead drummer hitting it that couldn't play in the center of the drum. This is a really great miking technique. So the cables cost about probably, I want to say $35 to have made. If you call it Redco, that's a great place to have them made. You can make them on your own, but they're a pain. It's better to have a professional company do it, I think. I think it's worth paying the extra money. They're using really high quality, what would be the same type of Megami cabling that you would typically use for mic setup. But so I had, I think 4 or 5 of these made at a time, because I figured, you know, a lot of times I'll record drummers with a rack and 2 toms, or maybe 2 racks and a floor tom, but typically with a lot of rock bands it'll be rack and 2 toms. So I wanted to at least be able to account for having 3 toms, sometimes 4. Sometimes you get drummers that would have 4 toms. Some jazz drummers will have 4 toms, guys like Dennis Chambers that will have 4 toms. But anyway, so this is a really cool miking technique. It sounds like the drum. That's the thing about miking the top and bottom. You get a complete picture of the drum. Now I want to take questions on this before I move on to our next double miking technique. Does anyone have questions? Michelle?
Yep.
Go ahead.
First, has Rick discussed how the Melvins mic their drums?
How do what?
The Melvins.
How the Melvins mic their drums? I have not discussed how the Melvins mic their drums, but I was actually going to discuss some full drum miking techniques, the Glenn Johns miking technique, things like that. But I'm not going to do that right now. And one of the reasons is that it takes more room to walk around the drums, and I want Michelle to get used to doing this right here.
Doing what?
To actually, because you're going to have to move the setup. It's harder to film on a live stream to film the miking of a drum set. It's easier to film individual miking.
Mm-hmm. A lot of questions.
A lot of questions. Go ahead.
Yep.
Oh, and let me just talk about this.
Yeah.
This mic here is new. These are about $425 now. You can buy them used. You've been able to buy them used forever for probably $250, $275. Honestly, I buy used mics all the time. Sennheiser 421s never go bad. They don't. You can buy them from the 60s and they work. So I wouldn't worry if you're buying on Reverb and the seller has a good rating, no problem, buy them. A 57, I want to talk about this in particular. The 57 you can buy new, I think they're about $100. This 57 is actually a little different. Let me show you this. I bought this from a place called Zen Pro Audio. My buddy Warren owns it. He's got a Z on it. This is actually a Shure mic that is transformerless. So I had his tech take the transformer out of this, and I'll tell you why. Transformerless 57s, they actually made a transformerless 57 back in the 70s. It was called an SM77. It was a shorter mic. I actually own one. It's about it stops about here because the transformer, I think, is in this part of the capsule or in this part of the body of the mic. But the SM77 is about that big. Without the transformer in it, it gives you more punch. Okay, it's a more open sound. It doesn't have quite the same output, but I really prefer for drums to have transformerless 57s. Not for guitar amps, not for miking guitars, but for drums, for toms and for snare. These are great. You can do them yourself. It's really messy to make them transformerless though. I think you have to boil the things and get the glue. There's glue that surrounds the transformer. I don't know the particulars. But Warren used to sell these at Zen Pro Audio. I don't know if he still does. This is years and years ago. I had a few of these. But I always use these on drums. So I almost forgot to tell you that. And that was, I want to say he sold it back in the day for $120 or something like that. But you can probably look on Warren's website and see. But that's a really, really cool, that's a cool tip there too, that a friend of mine told me about. I can't, it might have been Jim Scott even, the engineer who did Tom Petty's, he did the Rick Rubin record, Wildflowers. I think he might have told me about the Transformerless 57 using that. He gave me a couple different mic techniques that were unusual, like miking the underside of the ride cymbal, which I'll talk about at another point. Michelle, other questions?
They're mostly talking about the cable, this special cable.
Yeah. So Brendan had these cables that he had already built or had somebody built. He probably had them for years and years, but he always had done this. Back in the Chili Peppers, all this stuff. He always used Y cables. I think he came up with this back in the 80s because some guys, he's from Atlanta. I think some guys that worked at the studios where he kind of came up in, that they used Y cables. So it's really, really a cool thing. I tried it. Once I tried it, it's been 20 years or so, or not 20 years, surprise. 17 years I've been using them. I just always use them. And I love this particular combination. I've tried many other different mic combinations too, not just with the 421 and the 57, but that's a great blend. Like I said, you don't think of the 57 as something that's going to capture the bottom end, but it does, and it captures just the right amount of bottom end, and it self-corrects the EQ, so you don't end up EQing the mic nearly as much. And like I said, the Transformerless 57 gives it a little bit more oomph when you hear it. A lot of the tone of the drum, people don't realize, actually comes from the bottom head of the drum. I have a video that I haven't done any videos on drumming since way back at the beginning of my channel, but one of my biggest videos, that was the first one over 100,000 views, is how to tune your toms. And I go through, it's a pretty elaborate video on tuning your toms for those of you that are interested in drum tuning, so check that out. Now we're going to move, wait, did they have any other questions about this, Michelle, before I move to the snare?
No.
Okay, now we're going to move to the snare drum. Michelle? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move my chair over. Let's see if that works.
Hold on. Yep.
Is it back?
Yep.
Okay. So Bob Clear Mountain, I think when you get that far away, Michelle, it doesn't work very well. So if you stay over here.
Okay.
Would use this small diaphragm mic right next to the 57. Mm-hmm. This particular 57 is once again transformerless. What you want to do is you want to make sure the capsules on the two are right next to each other like this. Okay, so the mics are going to be either taped together, or I use a plastic tie, and the diaphragms are equal. Now you have to actually look inside the mic and make sure the diaphragms are lined up, because sometimes, because of the windscreen at the top of the mic, sometimes the capsules actually place back a little further, so they might even be like this, depending on what two mics you use. This is an old AKG 451 that I'm using, a vintage one. They to me sound much better than the new ones. They're about $400 on eBay. They were years ago. They were always that price. But you could really use any kind of, you can use an Audix, you could use a Shure KSM 141, you could use any type of small diaphragm condenser mic. Now, does it matter which side that the small diaphragm condenser mic is on? No. The capsules need to be next to each other. A lot of this will depend on how your drummer's setup is, because many times it's really tight getting the microphones in, depending on how your drummer has his hi-hat stand. His hi-hat stand may be here. You never know where it is, and sometimes it's tough to get a mic in. I typically like it at this angle, and I will typically aim it towards the center of the drum, but kind of across the center, okay? Well, once again, I don't want the drummer smashing the microphones. So if your drummer's doing rim shots, which I particularly want, unless I'm doing indie rock, then I want center hits. But rim shots, so rim shot meaning you hit the rim and the snare at the same time. You're going to get a lot of punch out of this. The small diaphragm condenser is going to give you the top end of the snare, the snarey sound, and it's going to give you more bottom end than the 57. The 57 is going to fill in the mid-range, and it's going to give the fat sound. And the transformerless 57 is going to work even better. Are we working there, Michelle? Is it working? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so I also have a bottom mic on the snare, which is pretty standard. It's going to be the same. I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the other microphone. In this case, it all depends on how I can get it under there and where it's going to go. I will sometimes put it right, angle it where it's right over or right facing the snares of the drum. It really depends on what the drum sounds like. I can't really say. Most of the times drummers will play with the throw off either on the side so that if they're right-handed they can get it. This is a trick throw off here, which is really smooth. It's a great, when I say throw off, I mean where you go and then you just turn it like that. This is a nice beautiful Black Beauty here with an Emperor X head on it, which sounds great. Great rock snare drum. This is actually an aftermarket trick throw-off that I bought with a special mount on eBay years and years ago, because the throw-offs that come on Ludwig drums are terrible. Even though the drums sound great, the throw-offs sound terrible. So the miking of the bottom mic, once again, sometimes you're stuck. You want to have the mics roughly the same distance, pretty much exactly the same distance from the bottom head and the top head, just on the toms. But you are somewhat limited, once again, because of your drummer's setup. Now, I make my drummers move their drums. I don't want somebody to be uncomfortable playing their kit, but for example, if their hi-hat is right above the snare drum, for example, right here, and you're getting a lot of bleed, sometimes I'll have them raise the hi-hats up a little bit. I don't want it to change the feel of their playing. Same thing with their overheads. I always make them have their two main crashes the same height, because you don't want the time it takes to get from the overhead up to from the crash to the overhead to be different on each side. You're going to get imbalanced. You're going to have weird phasing problems. Okay, so the two main crashes should be roughly at the same height. No, should be exactly at the same height. And make the drummers put them up there. Make sure they don't have them down too low. Another thing that drummers will do is they'll put their rack tom right above their kick drum. Their ride cymbal right above their kick drum if they're playing a 4-piece kit. And you get all the cymbal wash in the rack tom and in the floor tom. So these are just things you have to deal with. You have to, you end up improvising a lot. So this is really a triple miking. What I'll do then is sometimes I will blend the two mics. There's easy ways to blend it. You can blend it in Pro Tools or in Cubase or wherever you want. You can record these on separate tracks, blend them later. Or if you have a summing mixer, you can blend them when you record, or if you have a console, you can blend them when you record. I will EQ the mics differently. So these particular mics on the top, a lot of times I will EQ I'll usually use like an AKG 550A EQ. That's a great snare drum EQ that I like. Sometimes I'll use, as far as the mic pre's for these, what's that, Michelle?
API.
Huh?
You mean API?
What did I say?
AKG.
AKG. APIs. Thank you, Michelle. API 550A mic pre. They have the 550A and 550B. I don't care for the 550B. I like the 560 graphic EQ is excellent, but that's really, I use that for kick drum mainly, if I'm going to use it. But I like the 550As on on the snare top. The mic pre's that you use on these, I have particular ones that I like, but you use what you can afford to use. This is not an expensive setup here. You can find an inexpensive condenser, small diaphragm condenser mic to do this with that doesn't break the bank. And frankly, the $400 one is, it may be expensive for people, but this particular mic, getting a 451, something like this, is something you can use on acoustic guitar. So you always want to look for gear that can be used in multiple ways. You don't want to, I don't buy obscure, I try not to buy, I have some obscure microphones, but I try not to buy obscure things that have only one purpose. That's actually not true. I used to do it all the time. I don't buy any gear anymore. I haven't bought it in years. So that's snare drum. I'm not talking compression or anything. I'm talking mic setup here. Okay, this is, you're going to find when you do this, you're going to realize that, oh man, my snare sounds phenomenal. Having this condenser here is going to give you the top end that you want. It's going to give you the snare sound, the 7K of that snare. It's going to give you the deep low end that you don't get out of a 57. So we're going to move on to the kick drum now. We're going to talk about double miking a kick drum. Now I'm going to show you. You're probably going to shoot this way because as you're getting farther away from the router, it may go out. Okay, so I have a 22 by 14 inch kick drum here, an old Ludwig kick. This particular kick, I like 14 inch. What's that, Michelle?
What happens if drummer accidentally smacks the condenser?
Make him pay for it. I try to keep them out of the way, and I yell at them usually beforehand, and I just make them really aware of it. I mean, you got to be really bad to hit these things. They're not. I mean, you got to be so far off the center. A lot of times I'll go and I'll draw an X and marker in the middle of the snare, and I'll say aim for this. Just to make them doubly conscious of that. But look, in studios, your mics are going to get hit by drummers occasionally, and people break my cymbals. It happens all the time. It's just part of having, part of working with groups like that. Something you have to deal with. Okay, double miking kick drums. 14-inch kick drums are pretty much the only ones I use. I don't like those long ones, those 22 by 22s or 22 by 18s. They never sound good. They have the more depth, the worse the low end. This is I'm going to say this is not a 3-ply shell. I really like vintage drums with 3-ply shells. But this kick drum has a tremendous amount of low end. Now, this is double mic'd as you would normally double mic a kick drum. The kick-in mic is an Electro Voice RE20. Now this is a very common kick-in mic. It's a speech mic. It's really made for broadcasters. But what is great about it is that when it's close, it has a lot of bottom end and it has a lot of nice top end. Now I don't face it right at the beater. I will usually angle it. You can't see this, but if this is the head, I'll usually angle it like this and not right at the beater. I never aim it right at the center of the drum because there tends to be a null point in the center. Just like I'll typically not put my kick out mic right in the center. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Now I will move that microphone depending on what kind of sound I'm trying to go for. The kick-in mic might be this close, it might be this close. It really depends on what the drums sounds like. Okay, the kick-out mic. Now, I have an expensive kick-out mic right here. Can you see this, Michelle, the kick-out mic? Okay, this particular kick-out mic is an old AKG D36. It's a I want to say it's probably early 60s maybe. I'm not sure. AKG made the D12, they made the D20, they made the D25. You see those on the Beatles recordings. They made the D30. Now the D30 is what Zeppelin would use on John Bonham's. That was Andy Johns would typically use that on the Zeppelin records on the kick out, just as the one mic on the kick drum. The D36 is a figure 8 mic, meaning it has a capsule on each side, but I only use one side, so I only use the side facing the resonant head on the kick drum. Now I will typically place it, as you can see here, about right there. You'll see a lot of people that will put microphones in the hole with their second mic. Sometimes it'll be their only mic. Now I have the Beta 52 right here, and this is a good spot to put a microphone also. It's a good spot if you only have one input for one mic, because this is going to give you, it's not going to give you as much snap, but you're going to get a good complete sound of the kick. Now one of the problems though with putting a mic right in the hole there is that when the kick drum hits, there's a lot of air that's forced through there. And you have plosives, just like you'd have if somebody was going to be speaking into a mic. And you don't want to have that, actually. So a lot of times you'll see people put a windscreen in front of their kick-out mic if they put the mic in the hole. That's not uncommon. I've done that plenty of times. But I typically will do that if I'm using a condenser mic out there. Something like a Neumann 47 FET, which you'd find in really high-end studios. But it really depends. You have to listen to it. You can't generalize about these things. You can generalize about mic placement. I can tell you that a 14-inch deep kick is going to have more low end, whether it's a 22, 24, or 26. All of my kick drums are 14 inches deep. Bonham's kick drum, when he was always a 26 by 14, except on the first record, I'm pretty sure that, which Glenn Johns recorded on Zeppelin 1, was actually a 22, and he played with a 13 and 16 inch tom. Good times, bad times, things like that. So this is, let's talk about phasing here. What I did mention on the snare is that you're going to want to have the bottom mic out of phase with the top mics. But on the kick drum, typically with a 14-inch deep kick drum mic, the mics will be in phase with each other. But you have to check it anyways, because some mics are actually wired out of phase accidentally. You never know. With vintage mics, you might have a mic that's wired out of phase and you don't realize it. So you have to look at it. Now, I don't go scooting my mics in Pro Tools to line them up perfectly. You don't need to do that. Blend the mics, listen to them. What I'll typically do is if there's not a lot of cymbal hash, then I'll leave the mic open. If the drummer is playing and there's a lot of cymbal wash, I will put a tunnel over the mics. And one of the reasons you use a tunnel is to shield it from having all that hash from the cymbals, okay? It keeps it out of the kick-out mic. The kick-in mic is pretty isolated because it's basically in an isolation chamber. And so it's not going to have as much of the wash. If you do have that kind of wash, gating will take care of it after. And I personally blend my kick drum mics. I don't do it usually. The snares, a lot of times I will blend the snare top and bottom together. I've done that forever. The kicks, I don't necessarily do that, but sometimes I will do it. It really depends. If I'm going to tape, sometimes I will blend the mics on the go down. All depends on how hard the drummer hits the cymbals. And I tell them, don't bash the cymbal. Don't play lead cymbal because you don't want to get all that hash in there. Okay, questions?
Yep. Okay. So they were asking if you have a video where they can compare the double miking and single miking.
I don't, but I will.
Yep. And then, hi Rick, what do you think of modeling mics? For example, the Slate VMS.
Modeling mics. I just used one on a session recently, and I recorded a live session. I didn't record it, somebody recorded it for me. And I haven't pulled up the tracks yet, so I'll let you know once I listen to it, how it sounds. But I listened to it in the go down, I forget what it was. It was a modeling mic. it sounded pretty good, but it was a multi-mic piano, so it had 5 mics on it. So I'm gonna, when I compare these, I'll let you know. What else, Michelle?
Why do very old jazz records sound more exciting through the one mic they used in those days, and now the quality is better, but the feel is less?
Because people were used to playing in an ensemble in one room, and the bleed between instruments sounded great. So, you know, it's hard to compare old records and new records. They were recorded on tape. They could be recorded in different different types of rooms. The players were used to playing in ensembles, so they, if you're listening to a jazz record by Rudy Van Gelder, he was used to recording in his studio in New Jersey. He knew what it sounded like, and he knew where the best place to set up were, and he did hundreds of records. There's a great Keith Jarrett record called Birth that's incredibly well recorded. I want to say that, I'm trying to think who did it. Maybe it was on Atlantic Records or something, but it's a really great sounding record, incredible stereo separation. If you want to hear a great sounding jazz record, that's it. But the best sounding jazz record of all time, Johnny Hartman, John Coltrane, playing standards, unbelievable. Best, I think one of the greatest sounding jazz records, if not the greatest sounding jazz record of all time. One of the greatest recorded records of all time. So if you guys are audiophiles and you want to hear that, buy that record. It's Johnny Hartman and John Coltrane. I think that's the order that they are in the title. But do yourself a favor and buy this record and listen to the voice recording, listen to the instrument recording. Oh, and it's one of the best vocal recordings I've ever heard. And Train's playing and the whole ensemble playing is unbelievable on it. So. What else, Michelle?
Okay, how do you deal with drummers like the drummers that have 10 toms in a way?
Okay, so there's a couple ways to deal with it. You can either mic all the toms, which some people do. I remember seeing Nick Raskulinecz, who's a great producer, he produced some of the Foo Fighter records, or at least mixed and engineered. He's an excellent engineer and producer, but he did one of the Rush records, and he had every one of Neil Peart's toms double mic'd, top and bottom. I think he had 40 mics in the drums. You can probably see a picture on the internet. I'm sure you can of it. I remember seeing it. It was insane. But Glenn Johns, for example, who recorded all the Who records, used only a 4-mic Glenn Johns miking technique. And the reason he did that was because Keith Moon had so many drums and so many cymbals in the way, and he couldn't mic all of them. It just was impractical. And he felt that if he got a great stereo miking, and he had the mic on the floor tom, I'll do a video on the Glenn Johns miking technique, but the floor tom mic was over the floor tom like this, facing the hi-hat, and then he had one mic above the drums, both the same distance, about probably 42 to 44 inches away from the center of the snare, let's say. And then a kick drum mic and a snare drum mic, and that was it. Okay, so you don't have a lot of phase issues. You get a really fat sound, and you don't have to worry about all those stands in the way. So that's one of the ways to get around it. You either have to mic them individually, or you have to do something to capture all the drums.
Okay.
But you don't have to top and bottom mic all of them. And I wouldn't recommend that when you start getting into 4 or 5 toms, 6 toms. Michelle?
Alright. Could you talk a little bit about the 3-to-1 rule for miking to avoid phase issues?
Yeah, so the 3-to-1 rule. It's interesting because for every foot away, you want to be 3 feet further apart. I mean, there's this 3-to-1 rule, but the 3-to-1 rule doesn't really come into play that much in drum miking, believe it or not. Typically, in modern drum miking, you're going to have your overheads, and either the overheads are going to be cymbal mics, meaning that you're going to dump out the mid-range, and there's really not a lot of phasing issues with that. Or you're going to have overheads that are going to capture the kit. Now, the overheads can be placed like this in an XY pair like that. They can be a space pair, typically space pair. Usually the mics will be facing outward a little bit so they get more rejection of the snare. And so that they're not parallel with the tops of the drums, okay? But the 3-to-1 rule with multi-miking, like if I'm miking a cabinet, for example, let's say I'm miking 2 speakers. The 2 speakers are gonna be, it probably actually would be about 3-to-1, the distance between the 2 speakers. I will take the outer edges of the 2 speakers typically, or not the outer edges, but I'll take the 2 bottom speakers, the 2 top speakers, usually the 2 bottom speakers, and depending on how the speakers sound. And I'm gonna get in tight on the cabinet and right in on the grill and have them on 2 separate speakers because the phasing sounds better. All of this is done with your ear. You can check the phasing with your ear. You flip one of the mics out of phase, and you can move it till the sound kind of goes away, and that's a good way to check phasing on things, is to make the sound go away, then flip it so it's back in phase. So most phasing issues are done by ear. So you know, measuring things like that. The only thing that's worth measuring is it's worth measuring things, for example, the height of your overheads above your cymbals and the distance from the center of the snare, for example. Okay, so that you have the same, so you don't have any time issues in the length of time it takes for it to reach each overhead, because then you will have phase problems. So I say use your ears more than worry about the 3-to-1 rule, even though it's a good rule of thumb, but I don't think it's really applicable in most, and for example, recording drums, things like that. Michelle?
How do you mic double-headed?
A double-headed kick drum? Okay, good, that's a great question. Typically with this particular mic, because I actually bought that, the AKG mic, or it could be any type of mic, you move it around to where it sounds good. Usually in the center it does not sound the best. You'll see pictures of Bonham's kick drum mic'd in the center. But what you want to do is fine, because sometimes you get a null point in the center where it's kind of dead sounding, okay? Because of the way the air is hitting that head to make it resonate. So I will typically move the mic a little bit off center, and sometimes I will use just that mic, but sometimes I will take a 57, okay, or a condenser mic like a 414 that's in figure 8, and I will put it here in front of the kick drum, okay? This is something that Brendan, I think, would do, another thing he would do, that maybe it would be angled like this. It'll pick up the bottom of the snare and the front of the kick, okay? Which is a really cool thing. So it's in figure 8, so it's picking up on this side of the mic and on this side of the mic. Sometimes I'll just have a 57 on here that will get the beater, and once again it's going to be out of phase. But typically I'll just use one mic on the front and make sure there's not too much cymbal wash. Because if there's too much cymbal wash, you're in trouble. If your drummer doesn't know how to play with dynamics, it's going to be a problem. Because you got to play for the sound of the room. The drummers have to self compensate. They used to say that Bonham would go and play his drums and come back and listen to playback, and he would adjust to whatever room he was in, how hard he'd hit the drums. If you watch videos of him, he's not crushing the cymbals. He's crushing the drums, but not the cymbals. So the drummer needs to self-balance. There's nothing you can do. It's pointless to have room mics if your drummer plays the cymbals too loud, period. Just doesn't do any good. And these cymbals are, I always say if they're playing lead cymbal, I always tell them, hey man, nice lead cymbal. Because there's nothing you can do later on. You can't fix these things. So, Michelle?
Mm-hmm. And, what do you think of sub-kick?
I don't use sub-kick. I've owned sub-kicks before. I don't personally like them. You can just as easily use a sub-kick sample because every sub-kick sounds identical when you bring it into the control room. You may as well just put a sample on it, put the sub-kick on there. So to me, it's a pointless waste of an input to use a sub-kick.
Okay. Doesn't a small diaphragm condenser get a lot of hi-hat spill?
It can.
That's why you want to have it facing away from the hi-hat, and make sure that the drummer raises their hi-hat above the hi-hat as much as possible. But these are used all the time on records. Every pro engineer uses double miking for the most part on the snare like that. That's been used since the 80s, about Clear Mountain, like I said. But Brendan uses that. I mean, everybody uses that, the two mics together for the most part. That's just really, really common. And if you record it on separate tracks, you don't have to use both mics. If it has too much spill from the hi-hat in it, you don't have to use it. Sometimes you might gate that mic, gate both those mics. And sometimes you might blend the sample in. You gate those mics so you get that dynamics of it. You have a really super tight gate on your mix, and then use a sample mixed in with it, especially on the hard hits. And sometimes sometimes I'll ride my gate to turn on and off so that if they're doing super fast snare fills, you don't want the gate on because it'll sound really artificial, and you don't want the snare triggering like that. Even though nowadays samplers, if you're using I don't like the Stephen Slate sample thing that they have, but you know, or I like Trigger, actually works well. If you have Trigger, it can pick up the dynamics, and you can use it with superior drums, any drum program. And if you have a small room, you can make it sound like a huge room. So it's great, actually. Michelle?
Do you recommend moon gels?
I use moon gels all the time. Love moon gels. Check out my drum tuning video though, because I talk about moon gels a lot in that.
Okay, if you close mic the toms, you by definition will have comb filtering.
If you close mic the toms, you'll have cone filtering? No.
No. And then what about getting a Lars Ulrich?
Drum sound? He's the
Yep.
drummer from Metallica. Well, Lars, the room that they recorded Metallica in, the Black Album, for example, was a room in Vancouver that was a big room. I've actually been in the room before, and I've worked with Randy Staub in that room, who recorded the Black Album. And he said that he talked about this in the video of the making of the Black Album, where they went and bought all these pieces of plywood, and they shellacked them, and they put them all around the room to make it even more live. But the kick and snare have a sample on them. They just do. So part of his sound is the big, big room sound. And he played on that record, he played a lot of caveman fills. There's not a lot of super fast fills. If your drummer plays caveman fills, which they always sound good. You can't make them sound bad. If you're playing super fast stuff like that, you're not, when you start getting into there's a lot of really fast metal where they're playing playing the snares, playing the toms with really fast runs. You don't get a lot of beef out of them. A lot of the guys are not hitting rim shots, and then you end up getting a lot of cymbal wash, and you don't get a lot of power out of the drums. I've had this a lot. Guys who play super fast double kick and play a lot of these kind of blast beat, really fast snare and hat patterns and things like that. So you got to be careful with that. Couple more.
Okay, they're asking what is lead cymbal.
Lead cymbal? Lead cymbal is when your drummer is going like this and hitting the crash like Dave Grohl, and I love Dave Grohl, he's one of my favorite, but playing the crash in the chorus of every song. And that's all you hear. And what you don't want is if your crash cymbal's going like your drummer's crash cymbal's going like this, you're going to get all this weird phasing in the overheads, okay? You don't want the cymbal flopping around like that. If you tighten it too much, your drummer's going to break your cymbal. So they need to really not bash the cymbal. You want to have good definition in it. This is something we'll talk about when we talk about using miking with overheads. But it's tough to, drummers that played lead cymbal. That's actually a term that a sound guy used with my old band, yelling at our drummer. He's like, dude, you play lead cymbal. Because it was getting all in the vocal mic. I asked John Petrucci when I interviewed him about his headphone mix with Dream Theater, and he talks about how he doesn't have the vocal mic in there. And the reason he doesn't have it is because he doesn't want all the wash from the vocal mic picking up the drums You know, when that mic is open, it's in front of the drums, it's picking up all this cymbal hash. He doesn't want that in his mix, so he has no vocals in his mix for that particular reason. So that's one of the things that you have to be careful about, lead cymbal. Okay, one more, Michelle.
Okay, should the kick also be the same distance from the overheads, like the snare is?
No, see, the kick can't be the same distance because typically the snare is higher than the kick, so that's going to be a problem. You have to decide when you're talking about your phase of your overheads if you want to. If you're trying to capture the sound of the drum kit in the overheads, or you're using your overheads as cymbal mics, and it really depends on the style of music you're doing. Typically, I will check the phase of the snare drum with the overheads. That's much more crucial than what the kick drum sounds like with it. So I will have the drummer hit rim shots with the snare, and I'll flip the phase on both the overheads, and I'll decide whether the snare drum has more bottom end with the things in phase or out of phase. So there's a lot of checking of phase that you need to do with drum kits, but it depends on how the drum mics are set, how big the kit is, how far apart the mics are. There's so many variables you can't generalize about it. Okay, I think that's good for now. If you guys have any questions, put them in the comments section. If you're interested in my Modes in the Major Scale course, $25 off. I don't do it usually that. I've never done a discount like that, but that's RB25. This is the coupon code. Marty Friedman interview. Check out for you guys that are into amazing guitar playing, because Marty is one of the greatest of all time. So thanks everybody for watching. Thank you, Michelle. And leave your comments. I'll try and get to as many as I can.
Any discount for the Beato book?
Discount for the Beato book? Yeah, I'll give you $10 off. I'll put up a coupon code. Michelle, make up a coupon code for him right now. What is it?
Yep.
We'll just make one up and
Okay.
we'll put it in.
SB432.
SB432, like Sam Beato. 432. Okay, 432. Ooh, people are gonna think you're thinking about 432 hertz, Michelle.
Yeah, exactly.
SB432, $10 off the Beato book for 24 hours. That'll be in the next 3 minutes. We'll put that up. Leave your comments. Give it a thumbs up. Definitely leave comments though, and tell me if you want to see more videos on production stuff, because I haven't done any, and that's what I've been working at for the last 25 years. So I got a #1 album right back there. I just saw that. That's a #1 single. Of course, I didn't produce that. But anyways, thanks everybody for watching. You guys are awesome. Tell your friends to subscribe to my channel. And if you don't subscribe, hit the subscribe button and notification. Michelle?
Yep.
All right. See you guys.